Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
For context, my mom had suffered a severe stroke 3 years ago that left her partially paralyzed on her right side. She needed a walker to get around, and simple tasks that most of us take for granted became real challenges for her. My dad, bless his heart, was her rock through it all, but they rarely got to go out anymore because of the logistics involved. There was this amazing seafood restaurant in our town, the kind of place where the seafood is so fresh you can taste the ocean in every bite. It had been my parents' favorite spot for over 20 years. They used to go there for every anniversary and special occasion before Mom's stroke. Now they only went when either my sister or I could come along to help. That one evening I had promised to take them there for their 35th wedding anniversary. I made reservations a week in advance because this place was always packed. When we arrived, my dad dropped Mom and me off at the entrance while he went to find parking. Despite having reservations, there was still this ridiculous line just to check in with the hostess. I looked around for somewhere my mom could sit while we waited, but every bench was occupied, and no one offered their seat, despite seeing her struggling with her walker. We waited in that line for nearly 25 minutes. My mom was trying her best not to complain, but I could see the pain in her eyes from standing so long. My dad had joined us by then, and he kept asking if she wanted to leave, but she insisted on staying. This dinner meant so much to her. Just as we finally reached the hostess stand, this guy in an expensive suit came barging through the crowd, pushing past everyone like he owned the place. He immediately demanded to make a reservation right then and there. When I tried to explain that we were next in line, he dismissed me, saying it would only take a minute, and complained about how they had messed up his previous reservation. The hostess, who couldn't have been more than 20, just stood there like a deer in headlights while this guy steamrolled over everyone. He started listing his demands for a table for 9 people that Friday at 7 p.m., specifying that it had to be in the main dining room, not near the kitchen, and definitely not upstairs. He even insisted that she write down that he was a priority customer. The hostess started taking his information without saying a word to us. No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. My blood was boiling, especially seeing my mom trembling slightly from standing so long. When my dad tried to speak up about how long we'd been waiting, the entitled guy snapped back, declaring that some people had important dinner plans to arrange. That's when I noticed his name and phone number on the reservation book as the hostess wrote it down. I memorized every detail while silently fuming. After a while, he finally finished his demands and strutted away like he'd just closed a $1 million deal. We finally got seated, but the evening was already tainted. My mom tried to put on a brave face, but I could tell she was exhausted from all the standing. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about that entitled jerk and how he'd ruined what should have been a special evening for my parents. The next morning, I called the restaurant right when they opened. I put on my best trophy wife voice. When I got through, I pretended to be his wife and told them I needed to cancel their Friday night reservation. The hostess asked if everything was all right, and I smoothly explained that we had a change of plans, mentioning how my supposed husband had been so insistent about the reservation, but we'd been invited to a more exclusive event instead. I hung up, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and regret that I wouldn't be there to see his face when he showed up with 8 other people and no reservation. Later that week, I told my parents what I'd done. Instead of being disappointed, they both burst out laughing. My mom joked about how I was just as stubborn as she was at my age, while my dad wished we could be flies on the wall that Friday night. As luck would have it, my cousin worked as a server at a bar across the street from the restaurant. I called her the next Saturday to get the scoop. Apparently, entitled guy had shown up with his entire party dressed to the nines, only to find no reservation under his name. He threw such a tantrum that security had to escort him and his embarrassed guests out of the restaurant. It was raining that night, and they all had to wait outside for their cars while getting soaked. My mom passed away last year, but whenever I think about that night, I smile knowing I stood up for her in my own way. She might not have been able to stand up to entitled people anymore, but I sure could. My life changed dramatically a few years ago. After losing my father to Alzheimer's and my mother suffering a severe stroke shortly after, I found myself leaning heavily on my in-laws, who became my second family. I couldn't have been more grateful for them, especially my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, who I consider my actual brother. When my wife and I bought a house at the end of a cul-de-sac, they all stepped in to help us renovate it from top to bottom. The house needed serious work, and except for the electrical stuff that required professionals, we did everything ourselves. It was exhausting but rewarding work. However, our renovation journey quickly turned into a nightmare thanks to our neighbors at the very end of the street. Here's the thing about our cul-de-sac. It's incredibly narrow. Only one car can fit through at a time, and there's no turning space at the end. You have to reverse all the way out if you drive up. This wouldn't normally be a huge problem except for our lovely neighbors, an elderly lady and her entitled grandson. These people treated the public street like their private driveway. They parked in front of their house 24/7, and their daily visitors, usually the old lady's daughter and sons, would park wherever they pleased, often right in front of our house. During holidays, it was even worse. The entire street would be clogged with their visitors' cars, despite there being plenty of parking just 100 meters away at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. During our renovation, we needed to frequently unload building materials. At first, we tried to be accommodating. Every time they needed to pass, we'd stop what we were doing, move our car all the way down, let them through, then drive back up to continue unloading. But we started noticing a pattern. They would always need to leave about 5 minutes after we started unloading. One day, during a heavy unloading session, it happened again. The grandson came out and demanded we move our car because they were heading out. When I told him we'd be done in about 10 minutes and asked if they could wait, he flatly refused, saying they needed to leave right that moment. This became their standard response. They couldn't be bothered to wait even 5 minutes. Instead, they would often park behind our car and just leave, trapping us completely. We'd have to either wait or go knock on their door to ask them to move. The situation came to a head during the summer. We were clearing out our overgrown garden when my father-in-law suddenly collapsed from the heat. We immediately called for an ambulance, which arrived quickly and parked in front of our house, while the emergency medical workers treated him in the garden. Then the grandson showed up. He walked right into our garden and demanded we move the ambulance. When nobody responded, as everyone was focused on my father-in-law, he got even more aggressive. He started shouting, demanding that we move the ambulance immediately because he needed to get through. When nobody complied with his demands, he stormed off. But instead of parking at the entrance like a normal person, he parked his car behind the ambulance, completely blocking it in. When the emergency medical workers decided my father-in-law needed to go to the hospital, they couldn't leave. One of them went to the neighbor's house and knocked repeatedly, calling out that they needed the car moved immediately because they had a patient who needed to get to the hospital. There was no response. The medical worker went around the house and saw the grandson and his grandmother casually eating inside, completely ignoring the knocking. The medical worker had to call the police, who then called a tow truck. The grandson's car was towed away, and only then could we get my father-in-law to the hospital. Thankfully, it wasn't a stroke. He had collapsed from heat exhaustion. The incident caught the attention of city officials. They came to inspect the street and declared that our neighbors couldn't park in front of their house except for loading and unloading. But did they listen? Of course not. They kept parking there illegally, but now the city was watching. The first ticket was small, then another came bigger this time, and another even bigger. The city inspector makes regular rounds now, and the fines keep mounting because they refuse to follow the rules. Last week, I saw their car finally parked at the entrance of the cul-de-sac for the first time ever. The grandson looked furious as he walked the 100 meters to his house. My father-in-law, who has fully recovered, was working in our garden at the time. He cheerfully called out to the grandson, commenting on what a beautiful day it was for a walk. The next day, they got another ticket because they went back to their old habits. Some people never learn, but at least now it's costing them money every time they do it. Back in 2013, I landed a part-time HR position at a healthcare facility. As someone in their early 20s with only customer service experience, it seemed like a dream come true. They were willing to train me and I was eager to learn. My new boss seemed nice enough at first. She appeared genuinely happy to have an employee, and I quickly picked up all the paperwork aspects of the job within a week. She even praised my quick learning and efficiency. But then things started getting weird. It began with strange comments about my physical appearance. She would make disturbing remarks about how tiny I was, even saying she could pick me up and throw me. These comments evolved into more pointed remarks about my qualifications. She started telling me that I only got hired because I was cute and young. Mind you, she was a straight woman, so these comments were purely meant to diminish me. She constantly found ways to criticize me for being young, attractive, and slim. When she wasn't making these remarks, she tried pinning her own work errors on me, which usually backfired since I was meticulous with documentation. The office setup didn't help either. She had arranged our desks so that mine faced the wall while hers faced the back of my head. It felt like she was constantly watching me. After enduring this for a year, I quit and switched to a completely different field. Later I discovered she had just finished her degree, and I was her first employee, her first chance at being the boss. About a year after I left, the new administrator called me. He asked if I would consider coming back, offering a better position with higher pay. I asked about my former boss, and that's when I learned the truth. They had to escort her off the property. After I left, it became apparent she wasn't doing any of her actual job duties. Both she and the administrator were fired, but only she had to be walked out. Apparently, it didn't go smoothly. I accepted the position and worked there for another year before moving on to an even better opportunity. But the story doesn't end there. 2 years into my new role at a completely different nursing facility where I was part of the management team, guess who shows up? My former boss, but this time as a nurse, completely unrelated to her previous degree. Of all the places she could work, she ended up at mine. Being naturally forgiving, I decided to let the past stay in the past. I wasn't her direct supervisor, but I was her superior. Things were fine for about a month. Then my employees started getting strange warnings about improper procedures, but only on my days off. She spent the next year trying to shame my employees and department, but each attempt backfired on her. It got so bad that she lost her privileges to supervise her own nursing assistants. Recently, I accepted a position with a prestigious company that will train me to become their next regional general manager of all administrators. They're even paying for my education. Last week, I had a revealing conversation with her in the smoking area. I casually mentioned how crazy it was that we had worked together for so long. She agreed, saying we had seen many things together. I brought up her graduation from back then, mentioning it was her big break when her kids were in high school and doing well. She admitted it was a waste of $60,000, confessing she could never find another place that would hire her. When I questioned why she went back for her nursing degree, she explained it was to pay back her debt and fund her kids' college education. That's when I dropped the bomb, mentioning that I knew about her son dropping out and another running away to their dads. I also pointed out that all her schooling meant she was now about $80,000 in debt. She demanded to know who told me all this information, but I just smiled and told her I'd see her inside. Before this conversation, I had sent a mass message to all my employees about my new position. As we walked back inside, she had to follow behind me down the long corridor while everyone congratulated me on my new opportunity. For the next few weeks until my departure, she'll have to watch as everyone from residents to corporate management celebrates my success. She's stuck with $80,000 in debt, a failed bachelor's degree, a basic nursing certification, no supervisory privileges, and practically no job prospects due to her reputation. Meanwhile, I started with no formal education, have no student loans, am financially stable before turning 30, and am about to enter a program that will pay for my master's degree. In just a few years, I'll be her boss's Boss is boss. Not bad for someone who supposedly only got hired for their looks. I'm a 35-year-old software developer who inherited my grandparents' house after they passed away last year. It's a beautiful Victorian-style home with 4 bedrooms, and I've spent the past year renovating it to its former glory while working remotely. My cousin, who's been bouncing between relatives' homes for the past few years due to his temporary financial setbacks, called me about 3 months ago. He casually mentioned that he'd heard I was living in our grandparents' old place. When I confirmed this and mentioned I was fixing it up, he immediately launched into his request. He explained he was in a tight spot and asked if he could crash at my place for a week, just until he sorted some things out. I should have known better. My other relatives had warned me about his extended stays, but I felt guilty. After all, he grew up visiting this house too, and we used to be close as kids. I reluctantly agreed to the week-long stay, and he enthusiastically thanked me, saying he'd arrive the next day. He showed up with 4 massive suitcases and immediately claimed the largest guest room, the one I had just finished renovating. Within 3 days, he had completely transformed it. He hung up velvet curtains after drilling into my freshly painted walls without asking, set up some kind of makeshift entertainment center with my spare TV, and even installed a mini fridge he had delivered to the house. Then came the velvet rope. I came home from grocery shopping to find an actual velvet rope barrier outside his door, like the ones you see at clubs. There was a crude sign that read, VIP area, admission, $5. When I questioned what this was, he cheerfully explained that since this was his private suite now, he thought anyone wanting to enter should pay a small fee for the exclusive experience. I told him that this was my house and he couldn't charge people to enter rooms in it. He smugly responded that since he was living there now, it was his space and he was just implementing what he called reasonable boundaries. It got worse. He started leaving room service orders on his door every morning. One morning, he requested eggs Benedict with hollandaise sauce, fresh squeezed orange juice, and breakfast pastries. When I told him I wasn't running a hotel and he should make his own breakfast, he whined about being a guest and insisted it was common courtesy. The 1 week turned into 1 month, then 2. He never mentioned leaving. Instead, he started referring to it as our ancestral home in conversations with neighbors. I finally snapped when he tried to charge my mother, his aunt, $5 to enter his room when she came to visit. I demanded that he leave immediately. He refused, claiming he had established residence there and that it was his ancestral home as much as it was mine, even citing squatters' rights. When I insisted that it was my house that I had inherited, he threateningly said we'd see about that. Then he actually called the police. When they arrived, he put on quite a show, dramatically telling them that this was his family home and that I was trying to illegally evict him, emphasizing that he'd been living there for months. The police explained they couldn't do anything since it was a civil matter, but advised me to go through proper eviction procedures. That's when my neighbors, who had been watching this circus unfold for months, stepped in. My next-door neighbor, who happened to be a real estate lawyer, came over the next day with several other neighbors. They had a plan. They announced they were all there for the exclusive VIP room experience all at once. They all crowded into his room, completely ignoring his protests about admission fees. They stayed there, having an impromptu party, making it impossible for him to enjoy his private suite. Meanwhile, my neighbor helped me serve him proper eviction papers. When he realized I had legal backing and the entire neighborhood was against him, his attitude suddenly changed. He tried to backtrack, admitting he might have gotten carried away and asking for time to pack. I gave him 48 hours. When he tried to protest about his stuff, I repeated the 48-hour deadline, threatening to put everything on the front lawn if he didn't comply. He was out in 36 hours, leaving behind his velvet rope and a bunch of unpaid food delivery receipts. I later found out he tried the same stunt at another relative's house in a different state, but they had already heard about his squatter's rights adventure and shut him down immediately. The guest room is now my home office, and I have a new policy: no extended stays for anyone, no matter how much they claim it's their ancestral home. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.